Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest power. In a world where protocol rules everything, and one wrong move can mean life or death, a single moment of human connection can shatter all expectations. This is the true story of an 8-year-old boy whose desperate signal to a royal guard created a moment that no one present would ever forget. What started as a routine royal procession became something far more extraordinary when innocence met duty, and a trained soldier chose humanity over orders. The events that unfolded that day would challenge everything people believed about tradition, protocol, and the unbreakable bonds between strangers. The morning sun cast long shadows across Westminster as thousands of people lined the streets, their excited chatter filling the crisp London air. It was May 15th, 1987, and Queen Elizabeth II was making one of her rare public appearances through the historic district. The crowds had been gathering since dawn, families with children perched on shoulders, elderly couples sharing folding chairs, and tourists clutching cameras with trembling hands. Among the sea of faces stood 8-year-old Timothy Fletcher, pressed against the metal barriers with his grandmother, Margaret. Timothy had been looking forward to this day for weeks. His teacher had told the class about the royal visit, and his grandmother had promised to bring him to see the Queen. But as the morning wore on, Timothy's excitement began to mix with something else entirely. 3 days earlier, Timothy had overheard a conversation that had filled his young mind with terror. While playing in the garden behind his grandmother's house, he had seen 2 men in dark coats talking in hushed tones near the alley. Their words were fragments, but what he caught made his blood run cold. They spoke of the Queen, of today's route, and of something they called the signal. Timothy didn't understand everything, but he understood enough to know that something terrible was planned. He tried to tell his grandmother, but she had dismissed it as an overactive imagination. His parents were away on business, and the local police station seemed impossibly far and frightening to a boy of 8. So Timothy carried his terrible secret, the weight of it pressing down on his small shoulders like a physical burden. He had spent the last 3 nights barely sleeping, tossing and turning as he wondered what he should do. Now, standing among the crowd, Timothy's eyes darted nervously along the street. The royal procession was still 20 minutes away, but already he could see the advanced security teams taking their positions. Police officers stood at regular intervals, their watchful eyes scanning the crowd. But Timothy's attention was drawn to something else entirely. Near the corner of the street, partially hidden behind a newspaper stand, Timothy spotted one of the men from the alley. The man was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and a weathered face. He wore a long coat despite the warming day, and his hands remained buried deep in his pockets. Every few seconds, his eyes would flick toward his watch, then back to the street where the royal car would soon pass. Timothy's heart began to race. The man was positioned perfectly to see the entire route, and from his vantage point, he could easily signal to others. The boy's mind raced as he tried to remember the conversation he had overheard. Something about a diversion, something about creating chaos in the crowd. The details were fuzzy, but the intent was clear. Margaret Fletcher noticed her grandson's distress and knelt down beside him. "What's wrong, Timothy? You look as pale as a ghost." Timothy's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. How could he explain what he had heard? How could he make her understand that danger was lurking just meters away? The weight of responsibility felt crushing for someone so young. "Grandmother," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise. "Something bad is going to happen. I heard men talking about hurting the Queen." Margaret's expression shifted from concern to gentle amusement. "Oh, Timothy, you must have misunderstood. The Queen has the best protection in the world. Nothing bad will happen today." But Timothy wasn't convinced. His eyes remained fixed on the man by the newspaper stand, who had now been joined by another figure. This second man was younger, perhaps in his 30s, with dark hair and nervous movements. They exchanged brief words, and Timothy saw the younger man nod before melting back into the crowd. The royal procession was now visible in the distance, a line of black cars moving slowly down the street. The crowd's excitement reached a fever pitch, with children squealing and adults craning their necks for a better view. But Timothy felt only dread. He watched as the man by the newspaper stand pulled something from his pocket. It looked like a small radio or phone. Suddenly, Timothy understood. The signal wasn't something physical. It was going to be a communication to others positioned along the route. His child's mind began to piece together a scenario that terrified him. If the man gave a signal, others would create some kind of disturbance. In the chaos that followed, anything could happen to the queen. The lead car of the royal procession was now just 100 meters away. Timothy could see the distinctive profile of the queen through the window, her familiar silhouette instantly recognizable even at a distance. The crowd around him surged forward slightly, pressing against the barriers with anticipation. The man by the newspaper stand raised the device to his mouth. Timothy saw his lips move, though he couldn't hear the words over the roar of the crowd. This was it, the moment Timothy had been dreading. He looked around desperately, searching for a police officer, but they all seemed focused on crowd control and the approaching vehicles. Then, Timothy's eyes fell on the royal guards. These weren't the ceremonial guards he had seen at Buckingham Palace, but the real protection detail that surrounded the queen during public appearances. They were dressed in dark suits and moved with practiced efficiency, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. One guard in particular caught Timothy's attention. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He walked alongside the royal car, maintaining a perfect distance while remaining alert to every movement in the crowd. There was something about his demeanor that struck Timothy as different from the others, less rigid, more human. As the royal car drew closer, Timothy made a decision that would change everything. He had tried to warn the adults around him, but they wouldn't listen. The police were too far away, and there was no time to explain the complex situation he had witnessed. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could warn someone who would understand. The royal guard was now directly in front of Timothy, separated only by the metal barrier and perhaps 10 feet of space. The man's professional scan of the crowd brought his gaze across Timothy's section, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. In that instant, Timothy did something that went against every lesson about behaving properly in public. He began to wave frantically, not with the excited enthusiasm of a child hoping to catch the queen's attention, but with the desperate urgency of someone trying to communicate danger. His small hands moved in sharp, deliberate gestures, pointing toward the newspaper stand where the suspicious man waited. The guard's training had taught him to notice unusual behavior, and Timothy's frantic signaling immediately caught his attention. But what happened next was something that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Instead of dismissing the boy's actions as childish excitement, something in Timothy's expression made the guard look closer. The royal car was now just 50 meters away, and Timothy's panic was becoming more visible by the second. The guard's eyes followed the direction of the boy's pointing, and he spotted the man by the newspaper stand. To most observers, the man looked like any other spectator, but the guard's trained eye noticed something off about his positioning and behavior. The guard's name was Detective Sergeant James Morrison, and he had been protecting the royal family for over a decade. His instincts had been honed by years of experience, and right now, those instincts were telling him that something wasn't right. The boy's desperate attempts to communicate, combined with the suspicious behavior of the man by the newspaper stand, created a pattern that Morrison couldn't ignore. As the royal car continued its approach, Morrison found himself facing an impossible decision. Protocol dictated that he maintain his position and continue his protective duties without deviation. But a child was trying desperately to warn him of something, and his gut told him to listen. The man by the newspaper stand raised his communication device again, and Timothy's gestures became even more frantic. The 8-year-old boy was now jumping up and down, his face red with exertion and fear still pointing toward the potential threat. Other spectators began to notice Timothy's behavior, but they assumed he was simply overexcited about seeing the queen. Morrison made a split-second decision that would define the rest of the day. Instead of maintaining his protective formation around the royal car, he broke protocol and began moving toward the barrier where Timothy stood. His movement was subtle at first, a slight deviation from his assigned path that brought him closer to the excited boy. Timothy saw the guard approaching and felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone was finally paying attention to his warning, and terror that there might not be enough time to prevent whatever was about to happen. The royal car was now just 20 meters away, close enough that Timothy could clearly see the queen through the window, her familiar wave acknowledging the cheering crowd. The man by the newspaper stand spoke into his device one final time, then slipped it back into his pocket. His eyes scanned the crowd with the intensity of someone waiting for a predetermined signal. Timothy knew that whatever was going to happen would occur within the next few seconds. Morrison reached the barrier just as the royal car drew alongside. He leaned down toward Timothy, his professional demeanor softening as he looked into the boy's frightened eyes. "What is it, son? What are you trying to tell me?" Timothy's words came out in a rush, his voice high and strained with fear. "The man by the newspaper stand. He's been talking on a radio. I heard him and another man 3 days ago talking about the Queen and giving signals and doing something bad today." Morrison's blood ran cold. The timing, the location, the behavior patterns. Everything Timothy was describing aligned with the kind of coordinated threat that every protection officer dreaded. He glanced toward the newspaper stand and saw the man watching the royal car with an intensity that seemed different from the casual interest of spectator. The royal car was now directly in front of them, moving at its stately pace of perhaps 10 miles per hour. The Queen's window was open, and she was waving to the crowd with her characteristic grace. The moment was picture-perfect, exactly the kind of scene that appeared on postcards and in tourism brochures. But Morrison now saw it through the lens of potential danger. In the crowd near the newspaper stand, Morrison spotted 2 other men who seemed to be positioned strategically along the route. They weren't together, but their body language suggested they were waiting for something. One kept checking his watch, while the other maintained a clear line of sight to the royal car. Morrison's radio crackled with routine communications from other members of the protection detail. The procession was proceeding normally, with no reported incidents or concerns. But standing there, looking into Timothy's frightened eyes and seeing the suspicious positioning of multiple individuals along the route, Morrison knew that something was very wrong. The detective sergeant had seconds to make a choice that could define his entire career. If he was wrong about the threat, breaking protocol to investigate a child's warning could result in disciplinary action or worse. But if he was right, and he did nothing, the consequences could be catastrophic. Timothy continued his desperate attempts to communicate, his small hands now gripping the metal barrier as he tried to make the guard understand the urgency of the situation. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise. "I know I'm just a kid, but I heard them talking. They're going to hurt the Queen." Morrison looked once more at the men positioned along the route, then back at Timothy's earnest face. In that moment, years of training and instinct combined with something more fundamental, the recognition of genuine fear in a child's eyes. He made his decision. Without another word, Morrison stepped back from the barrier and spoke rapidly into his radio. His words were coded, but their meaning was clear to anyone trained in royal protection protocols. He was reporting a potential threat and requesting immediate response from backup units. The royal car continued its slow progress, now moving past Timothy's position. The Queen continued to wave, unaware of the drama unfolding just meters away. But Morrison was no longer focused on the car. His attention was entirely on the suspicious individuals Timothy had identified, and his hand moved instinctively toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. The man by the newspaper stand noticed Morrison's change in behavior and body language. Their eyes met across the crowd, and in that instant, both men understood that the game had changed. The suspicious individual's relaxed facade cracked slightly, revealing the tension beneath. Morrison began moving through the crowd, his path taking him directly toward the newspaper stand. Other protection officers, responding to his coded radio message, began subtle repositioning movements of their own. The crowd remained oblivious to the unfolding drama, their attention focused entirely on the royal car and its precious cargo. Timothy watched with a mixture of hope and terror as the guard he had warned began to take action. His grandmother, finally, noticing the interaction, looked down at her grandson with confusion and growing concern. The festive atmosphere of the royal visit remained intact for everyone else, but for Timothy, Morrison, and the suspicious men positioned along the route, the next few minutes would determine whether the day ended in celebration or tragedy. Detective Sergeant Morrison moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, his trained eyes never leaving the man by the newspaper stand. The royal car had passed Timothy's position and was continuing its slow procession down the street, but Morrison's focus had shifted entirely to the potential threat. Years of protection work had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every alarm bell in his head was ringing. The suspicious man seemed to sense the attention focused on him. His casual stance shifted slightly, and his eyes began darting around the crowd as if looking for escape routes. When he spotted Morrison approaching, his face went pale, confirming what the detective sergeant had already suspected. This was no innocent spectator. Morrison spoke quietly into his radio, updating his colleagues on the developing situation. Tango 1 moving toward newspaper stand. Suspect appears aware of surveillance. Request backup units to positions 2 and 3. His voice was calm and professional, but Timothy, still watching from the barrier, could see the tension in the guard's movements. The man by the newspaper stand suddenly pushed away from his position and began moving quickly through the crowd. He wasn't quite running, but his pace was urgent enough to attract attention from nearby spectators. Morrison immediately shifted direction to follow, speaking rapidly into his radio. Tango 1 is mobile. Suspect moving east through crowd section 7. Timothy felt his grandmother's hand grip his shoulder as she finally began to understand that something serious was happening. Timothy, what did you say to that man? What's going on? I told him about the bad men, grandmother, Timothy replied, his eyes still fixed on the unfolding drama. The ones I heard talking about hurting the queen. Margaret Fletcher's face went white as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She had dismissed her grandson's warnings as childish imagination, but now she could see armed officers moving through the crowd with obvious urgency. The festive atmosphere of the royal visit was beginning to crack as more people noticed the unusual activity. The suspect was now moving more quickly, pushing through the crowd with increasing desperation. Morrison maintained pursuit, but the dense crowd made rapid movement difficult. Other protection officers were converging on the area, their coordinated movements creating a tightening net around the fleeing man. Near the newspaper stand, Morrison spotted something that made his blood run cold. A small device had been left behind, partially hidden among the newspapers. It looked like some kind of timer or trigger mechanism, and its presence confirmed that Timothy's warning had been absolutely correct. This wasn't just a suspicious individual. This was an active threat to the Queen's safety. Control, this is Morrison. He spoke urgently into his radio. Device discovered at location 1. Requesting bomb disposal unit immediately. Also need complete route deviation for the royal vehicle. The response was immediate. Within seconds, Morrison could hear other officers communicating with the drivers of the royal procession. The Queen's car, now several hundred meters down the street, began to alter its course. The change was subtle enough that most spectators didn't notice, but the protection detail was already implementing emergency protocols. The fleeing suspect had reached the edge of the crowd and was now attempting to blend into the flow of normal pedestrian traffic. But Morrison had no intention of letting him escape. The detective sergeant had spent over a decade protecting the royal family, and he had never encountered such a clear and immediate threat. The device by the newspaper stand could have been anything: a bomb, a signal trigger, or something worse. Morrison broke into a run, his formal protection role temporarily abandoned as he became a pursuer rather than a guardian. The suspect saw him coming and abandoned all pretense of innocence, breaking into a full sprint down a side street. The chase was now clearly visible to hundreds of spectators, and confused murmurs began rippling through the crowd. Timothy pressed against the barrier, straining to see what was happening. His grandmother tried to pull him away from the scene, but the 8-year-old was transfixed by the consequences of his decision to warn the guard. He had started something that was now spinning rapidly out of control, and he felt both terrified and strangely proud that someone had finally listened to him. The suspect ran down Whitehall Street, his heavy breathing and panicked movements making it clear that he was not professionally trained for this kind of escape scenario. Morrison, in contrast, moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had undergone extensive physical training. The gap between them was steadily closing. Behind them, the royal procession had come to a complete stop while bomb disposal experts examined the device found near the newspaper stand. The Queen's car was now surrounded by a tight circle of protection officers, and emergency vehicles were beginning to arrive at the scene. The carefully orchestrated royal visit had become a major security incident in a matter of minutes. The fleeing man turned abruptly into a narrow alley, hoping to lose his pursuer in the maze of small streets that characterized this part of London. But Morrison knew these streets intimately. He had walked this beat for years before joining the Royal Protection Detail, and every alley and shortcut was burned into his memory. As they ran, Morrison continued providing updates to his colleagues. Suspect heading north through Craven Alley. Appears to be making for the underground station. Need units to block exits at Westminster and St. James Park stations. The chase had now attracted the attention of regular police officers in the area, who joined the pursuit as it moved through the streets. The suspect looked increasingly desperate, his head turning constantly as he searched for escape routes that were rapidly being cut off. Timothy, still at the barrier with his grandmother, could no longer see the actual chase, but he could hear the sirens and radio chatter that indicated a major operation was underway. Other spectators were beginning to understand that something significant was happening, and the festive atmosphere of the royal visit was giving way to nervous excitement. "Did I do the right thing, grandmother?" Timothy asked, his young voice filled with uncertainty. Margaret Fletcher looked down at her grandson with a mixture of amazement and pride. "Yes, Timothy, you may have saved the Queen's life today." The chase continued for several more blocks, with the suspect becoming increasingly cornered as police units closed off potential escape routes. Morrison could see that the man was tiring, his movements becoming more erratic and desperate. But cornered individuals could be the most dangerous, and Morrison remained cautious as he continued the pursuit. The suspect suddenly stopped running and turned to face his pursuer. Morrison could see something in the man's hand. It looked like another small device, similar to what had been found by the newspaper stand. The detective sergeant immediately stopped his advance and began speaking into his radio. "Control, suspect has stopped in Craven Alley approximately 50 meters north of Whitehall. He appears to be holding a device, requesting immediate backup and establishing a perimeter." The standoff that followed was tense and silent. Morrison maintained his distance, his hand resting on his concealed weapon while he waited for backup to arrive. The suspect stood perfectly still, the device held prominently in his raised hand. Neither man moved, creating a frozen tableau in the narrow London alley. Within minutes, the area was surrounded by armed police units. The suspect found himself facing overwhelming force, with no remaining escape routes and no options except surrender. But instead of giving up immediately, he began shouting demands. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice echoing off the alley walls. "I have a trigger device. One wrong move, and people die." Morrison's training took over. He began speaking in calm, measured tones, tried to establish dialogue with the increasingly desperate man. "Nobody needs to get hurt today. Just put the device down, and we can talk about whatever is bothering you." "You don't understand," the suspect replied, sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool air. "This was supposed to be a message. The whole system is corrupt. The monarchy represents everything that's wrong with this country." The political motivation behind the threat was now becoming clear. This wasn't random violence, but a carefully planned attack intended to make a statement. Morrison realized that Timothy's overheard conversation had likely involved multiple individuals working together on a coordinated plan. "What kind of message requires hurting innocent people?" Morrison asked, slowly moving closer while keeping his hands visible. "There are better ways to make your point." "You wouldn't understand," the suspect shot back. "You're part of the system. You protect the symbols of oppression while ordinary people suffer." Morrison could see that the man was becoming increasingly agitated, which made the situation more dangerous. Backup units were in position, but the narrow alley limited their options for safely resolving the standoff. The device in the suspect's hand remained the primary concern. Nobody knew exactly what it was capable of or how it connected to the device found by the newspaper stand. Back at the royal viewing area, bomb disposal experts had carefully examined the device Timothy had helped identify. Their preliminary assessment was that it was indeed an explosive device, sophisticated enough to cause significant casualties in the densely packed crowd. The 8-year-old boy's warning had potentially prevented a major terrorist attack. News of the thwarted threat was already spreading through official channels. The Queen, safely secured in her vehicle, had been briefed on the situation and had expressed her gratitude for the quick action taken by her protection detail. But she had also asked specifically about the child who had provided the initial warning. Timothy remained at the barrier with his grandmother, watching as emergency vehicles continued to arrive at the scene. He didn't fully understand the magnitude of what he had set in motion, but he could sense that something very important was happening. Other children in the crowd were asking their parents why the pretty parade had stopped, but Timothy knew the answer. The The standoff in the alley continued for nearly 20 minutes. Negotiation specialists had arrived and taken over the dialogue with the suspect, while Morrison maintained his position as the primary tactical officer on scene. The man with the device was gradually being worn down by the overwhelming police response and the futility of his situation. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," the suspect finally said, his voice breaking with exhaustion and defeat. "There were supposed to be others. There was supposed to be a coordinated response." Morrison seized on this admission. What others? How many people were involved in this plan? The suspect's resolve was clearly cracking. The reality of a situation, surrounded, outnumbered, and with no escape routes, was finally sinking in. "I don't know all of them. I only knew my part. We were supposed to create chaos during the royal visit. Multiple locations, multiple distractions." This revelation sent shock waves through the operation command. If there were other elements to the plot that hadn't been neutralized, the Queen and the thousands of spectators could still be in danger. Morrison immediately relayed this information to his colleagues, who began coordinating with other security units throughout London. The suspect's admission also explained why Timothy's overheard conversation had been so fragmentary and confusing. The 8-year-old had stumbled across a piece of a much larger conspiracy, involving multiple individuals and multiple targets. His decision to warn Morrison had disrupted just one element of what could have been a devastating coordinated attack. Emergency response teams throughout London began implementing enhanced security protocols. Other royal family members who were engaged in public activities were immediately secured, and public gatherings across the city were quietly increased surveillance. The scope of the potential threat was far larger than anyone had initially imagined. In the alley, negotiators were making progress with the increasingly exhausted suspect. The device in his hand was still a concern, but his body language suggested that his resistance was weakening. Morrison remained ready to act if the situation deteriorated, but he was hopeful that a peaceful resolution was possible. "You mentioned others," one of the negotiators said calmly. "If you help us identify them, we can make sure nobody gets hurt. That's what you want, isn't it? To make your point without harming innocent people." The suspect looked around at the overwhelming police presence, then back at the device in his hand. After a long moment, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "I never wanted anyone to die," he said quietly. "This was supposed to be about sending a message, not killing people." "Then, help us prevent any violence," the negotiator replied. "Put the device down and tell us about the others involved." The suspect hesitated for another few seconds, then slowly placed the device on the ground and raised his hands. Morrison immediately moved forward to secure the device, while other officers moved in to arrest the man. The immediate crisis was over, but the investigation into the larger conspiracy was just beginning. As news of the arrest spread through the command structure, Timothy's role in preventing the attack became increasingly clear. The 8-year-old boy who had tried desperately to warn someone about what he had overheard had potentially saved dozens or even hundreds of lives. His persistence in the face of adult dismissal had made the difference between a successful royal visit and a national tragedy. The device found by the newspaper stand was confirmed to be a sophisticated bomb designed to detonate during the peak moment of the Queen's passage. The trigger device, carried by the suspect, would have allowed him to coordinate the timing perfectly, maximizing casualties among the densely packed crowd of spectators. Timothy's warning had prevented this scenario from unfolding. But even as the immediate threat was neutralized, security officials knew that their work was far from over. The suspect's admission of a larger conspiracy meant that other individuals were still at large, potentially planning additional attacks. The thwarted bombing had revealed just one thread of what appeared to be a much larger and more dangerous web. The arrest of the first suspect was just the beginning of what would become one of the largest security operations in British history. As Detective Sergeant Morrison helped secure the scene in the alley, intelligence analysts were already working to piece together the fragments of information that had emerged from the interrogation. The suspect's admission of a coordinated plot involving multiple locations sent shockwaves through every level of law enforcement. Timothy Fletcher remained at the barrier with his grandmother, unaware that his simple act of trying to warn someone had triggered a national security crisis. The royal procession had been completely halted, and the Queen's vehicle was now surrounded by an impenetrable wall of protection officers. Emergency vehicles continued to arrive at the scene, their flashing lights creating an almost surreal atmosphere among the confused spectators. Back at Scotland Yard, Commissioner Patricia Williams convened an emergency meeting with representatives from MI5, the Metropolitan Police Counterterrorism Unit, and the Royal Protection Squad. The arrested suspect, identified as Marcus Thornton, was a 34-year-old electrician with no previous criminal record, but with known connections to several radical political groups. His clean background had made him an ideal operative for whoever had planned this attack. What do we know about the scope of this operation? Commissioner Williams asked, her voice tense with the gravity of the situation. Detective Inspector Sarah Chun, who led the counterterrorism unit, consulted her rapidly growing file of information. Preliminary interrogation suggests at least 4 separate cells operating independently. Thornton only knew his own role and had minimal contact with the others. Classic cell structure designed to prevent exactly what we're trying to do now, rolling up the entire network. The implications were staggering. If there were multiple cells operating with similar capabilities to what they had just discovered, London could be facing a coordinated terrorist attack unlike anything seen since the troubles of previous decades. The fact that it was targeting the royal family made it even more serious, as an attack on a monarchy would represent an assault on the very foundations of British society. Meanwhile, bomb disposal experts were carefully examining both devices that had been recovered. The sophistication of the explosives was concerning. These weren't crude homemade bombs, but professionally constructed devices that suggested significant technical knowledge and resources. The timer mechanisms were particularly worrisome, as they indicated a level of coordination that required precise planning and communication. The devices are identical in construction, reported Chief Inspector Michael Torres from the Bomb Disposal Unit. Same explosive compound, same timer mechanism, same trigger design. Whoever built these has serious technical skills and access to military-grade materials. This revelation raised new questions about the nature of the conspiracy. Acquiring military-grade explosives required either insider access or connections to international terrorist networks. The investigation was rapidly expanding beyond a simple domestic threat to something with potentially global implications. Timothy, still pressed against the barrier, was beginning to understand that something truly massive was unfolding around him. Police officers were moving through the crowd, asking questions and taking statements from witnesses. His grandmother had tried several times to lead him away from the scene, but Timothy felt compelled to stay and watch the consequences of his decision to speak up. "Grandmother," he said quietly, "do you think there are more bad men like the one the police caught?" Margaret Fletcher looked down at her grandson with growing amazement at his perceptiveness. "I don't know, Timothy, but thanks to you, the police are looking for them now." The investigation was indeed expanding rapidly. Within hours of the arrest, security services had identified 3 other individuals with connections to Marcus Thornton. 2 were fellow members of a radical political group called the People's Liberation Front, while the third was a former military explosives expert who had been discharged from the Army under suspicious circumstances. Detective Sergeant Morrison, having completed his role in the immediate arrest, was now working with intelligence analysts to trace the connections between these individuals. The pattern that emerged was deeply concerning. Each person had specific skills that contributed to the overall plot: explosive expertise, surveillance capabilities, communication systems, and insider knowledge of royal protection protocols. "This isn't amateur hour," Morrison told his colleagues during a briefing session. "These people have been planning this operation for months, possibly years." The level of detail in their planning suggests they had access to information that should have been restricted. The possibility of insider involvement sent another shock wave through the investigation. If someone within the security services or royal household had been providing information to the terrorists, the implications for national security were almost unimaginable. Every person with access to royal protection details would need to be investigated and cleared. As the investigation expanded, Timothy's role in preventing the attack became increasingly celebrated within law enforcement circles. The 8-year-old boy who had overheard a fragment of conversation and had the courage to act on it had potentially prevented a national catastrophe. His persistence in trying to warn someone, despite being initially dismissed by adults, had made all the difference. But Timothy himself remained largely unaware of his growing reputation. He was still standing at the barrier, watching the organized chaos of the investigation unfold around him. Police photographers were documenting every aspect of the scene, while forensics experts searched for additional evidence that might lead them to the remaining conspirators. The Queen, safely secured in her vehicle, had been briefed on the developing situation. Her immediate reaction was gratitude for the quick action that had prevented the attack, but she also expressed concern for the brave child who had provided the crucial warning. A message was sent through the chain of command requesting that the boy and his family be personally thanked for their service to the crown. Meanwhile, the three suspects identified through their connections to Marcus Thornton were being located and arrested simultaneously across London. The coordinated raids, conducted by armed police units, yielded a treasure trove of evidence about the scope and sophistication of the conspiracy. At a flat in East London, officers discovered detailed maps of the royal procession route, timing charts that showed exact arrival times at each location, and communication equipment that had been used to coordinate the various elements of the attack. The level of detail was extraordinary. The terrorists had planned for multiple contingencies and had backup plans for their backup plans. The second location, a garage in South London, contained the workshop where the explosive devices had been constructed. In addition to finding materials for several more bombs, investigators discovered blueprints that showed the terrorists had been planning attacks on multiple royal venues, including Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and the Houses of Parliament. The third raid, on a house in North London, uncovered the communication center for the entire operation. Banks of radio equipment, encrypted communication devices, and detailed surveillance reports showed that the terrorists had been monitoring royal family movements for months. They had photographs of protection officers, detailed schedules of royal activities, and even floor plans of secure facilities. Detective Inspector Chun, coordinating the multiple investigations, was stunned by the scope of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just an attack on today's procession, she reported to Commissioner Williams. This was a comprehensive assault on the entire royal family and the institutions of government. They were planning to strike multiple targets simultaneously. The evidence suggested that the attack thwarted by Timothy's warning was meant to be just the opening move in a much larger campaign of terror. The explosions during the royal procession would have created chaos and drawn emergency responders to the scene, while secondary attacks targeted other locations across London. The psychological impact would have been devastating, potentially destabilizing the government and creating widespread panic. As news of the expanding investigation leaked to the media, London found itself under an unprecedented security lockdown. All royal family members were moved to secure locations. Public gatherings were canceled or heavily restricted, and armed police became a visible presence on every street corner. The city that had awakened to a festive royal celebration now felt like it was under siege. Timothy's grandmother finally succeeded in leading him away from the scene as the crowd was dispersed for safety reasons. But as they walked home through streets filled with police vehicles and emergency responders, Timothy couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he had overheard 3 days earlier. If he had acted sooner, or if the adults around him had taken his warnings more seriously, could this entire crisis have been prevented? The investigation continued through the night as intelligence analysts worked to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. Each piece of evidence led to new connections, new suspects, and new potential targets. What had begun as Timothy's overheard conversation was revealing itself to be part of a terrorist network that posed a threat to the very foundations of British society. By morning, the authorities had identified 12 individuals connected to the plot, with arrest warrants issued for 8 of them. The 4 who had been captured in the initial raids were providing valuable intelligence under interrogation, but they revealed that the conspiracy extended beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The investigation had also uncovered international connections. Some of the funding for the operation had come from overseas sources, and several of the conspirators had received training in foreign countries known for supporting terrorist activities. What had appeared to be a domestic threat was revealing itself to have global implications. Commissioner Williams faced a difficult decision. The scope of the conspiracy was so large that a conventional investigation might take months to complete, during which time the remaining conspirators could either escape or launch additional attacks. She authorized the largest anti-terrorism operation in British history, involving hundreds of officers and intelligence agents working around the clock to neutralize the remaining threats. The operation was given the code name Golden Crown, in recognition of the target that the terrorists had sought to attack. Every resource available to British law enforcement was dedicated to tracking down the remaining conspirators and ensuring that no element of their plot remained active. Timothy Fletcher, the 8-year-old boy whose overheard conversation had started it all, slept peacefully in his grandmother's house, unaware that his simple act of courage had triggered a national security operation involving thousands of people. His decision to trust his instincts and warn Detective Sergeant Morrison had prevented what could have been one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in British history. But the investigation was far from over. The evidence gathered from the raid suggested that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, the ideology and network that had created this conspiracy remained active. The authorities knew that vigilance would be required for months or even years to come to ensure that this level of threat never again came so close to success. The captured conspirators had revealed that their ultimate goal was not just to attack the royal family, but to create enough chaos and fear to destabilize the entire British government. They believed that a successful attack on a monarchy would inspire others to rise up against what they saw as an unjust system. Their failure to achieve this goal was due entirely to an 8-year-old boy who had the courage to speak up when he sensed danger. As dawn broke over London, the city began to return to a semblance of normalcy. But everyone involved in the investigation knew that the events of the previous day had revealed vulnerabilities in national security that would need to be addressed. The fact that such a sophisticated conspiracy had come so close to success was a wake-up call that would reshape how Britain approached the protection of its most important institutions and figures. 3 days after the thwarted terrorist attack, Timothy Fletcher sat in his grandmother's small living room, still trying to process everything that had happened. The media had descended on their quiet neighborhood like a swarm, with reporters and camera crews camped outside their doors seeking interviews with the boy who had saved the Queen. Margaret Fletcher had firmly refused all requests, determined to protect her grandson from the overwhelming attention. Detective Sergeant Morrison knocked gently on the front door that Tuesday morning, having navigated through the crowd of journalists with the help of police barriers. He carried with him an ornate envelope bearing the royal seal, a personal message from Queen Elizabeth II herself, expressing her gratitude to the brave young boy who had prevented a national tragedy. "Mrs. Fletcher," Morrison said when Margaret opened the door, "I hope you'll allow me a few minutes to speak with Timothy. Her Majesty has asked me to deliver this personally." Margaret's eyes widened as she saw the royal seal. Throughout the chaos of the past few days, she had struggled to fully comprehend the magnitude of what her grandson had accomplished. The arrest of 12 terrorist suspects, the discovery of a massive conspiracy, and the prevention of multiple attacks across London, all because an 8-year-old boy had the courage to warn someone about a conversation he had overheard. Timothy looked up from his position on the sofa, where he had been quietly reading a book about knights and dragons. The irony wasn't lost on Detective Morrison. The boy who had acted with the courage of a legendary hero was now immersed in stories about fictional ones. "Hello, Timothy," Morrison said, settling into a chair across from the boy. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. Your warning prevented something terrible from happening." Timothy set down his book and looked seriously at the detective sergeant. "Did you catch all the bad men?" "We've arrested 12 people so far," Morrison replied, "and we're still looking for a few more. But because of what you told me, we were able to stop them before they could hurt anyone." The investigation had indeed continued to expand in the days following the initial arrests. Operation Golden Crown had become one of the largest anti-terrorism investigations in British history, with over 200 officers working around the clock to track down every lead and connection. The evidence recovered from the various raids had revealed a conspiracy that was even more extensive than initially suspected. The terrorists had been planning what they called Black Wednesday, a coordinated series of attacks designed to occur simultaneously across London. In addition to the bomb at the royal procession, they had planned to detonate explosives at Westminster Abbey during a memorial service, attack the Houses of Parliament during session, and target several embassies in the diplomatic corps. The psychological impact of such coordinated attacks would have been devastating, potentially causing hundreds of casualties and creating widespread panic throughout the capital. "Timothy," Morrison continued, pulling out the royal envelope, "the Queen wanted me to give you this. She wrote it herself to thank you for your bravery." Timothy's eyes grew wide as he took the heavy paper. The envelope was cream-colored with gold edges, and the royal seal was embossed in red wax. With careful fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was elegant and formal, but the message was warm and personal. "My dear Timothy," the letter began, "I have been informed of your extraordinary courage and quick thinking during my recent visit to Westminster. Your decision to warn my protection officer about the dangerous men you had overheard has prevented a terrible tragedy and saved many innocent lives. Though you are still young, you have shown the kind of bravery that we associate with our greatest heroes. I would be honored to meet you personally and thank you for your service to our nation." The letter was signed simply Elizabeth R., and below the signature was a small personal note. "I hope we can find time to talk about knights and dragons. I understand they are particular interests of yours." Timothy read the letter twice, his young mind struggling to process the reality that the Queen of England knew about his favorite books and wanted to meet him personally. His grandmother, reading over his shoulder, felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized the full extent of her grandson's heroism. "She wants to meet me?" Timothy asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Indeed she does," Morrison replied with a smile. "In fact, there's going to be a special ceremony at Buckingham Palace next week. The Queen wants to personally thank you and present you with a commendation for bravery." The news of the planned ceremony sent the media into an even greater frenzy. Timothy Fletcher was becoming a national hero, with newspapers across the country running front-page stories about the boy who saved the Queen. Editorial writers praised his courage and used the story as an example of how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences when they chose to act on their convictions. But the attention was overwhelming for an 8-year-old boy. Timothy found himself unable to leave his grandmother's house without being mobbed by reporters and photographers. Well-meaning strangers sent gifts and letters, while television producers competed to secure exclusive interview rights. Margaret Fletcher felt increasingly protective of her grandson, worried that the intense scrutiny might harm his normal childhood development. Detective Morrison, understanding these concerns, had arranged for police protection for the Fletcher family. Officers maintained a discreet presence outside their home, ensuring that Timothy could have some semblance of privacy while the investigation continued and media attention remained intense. The investigation itself was yielding remarkable results. The 12 arrested suspects were providing intelligence that led to the discovery of additional cells and support networks throughout Europe. What had appeared to be a domestic British conspiracy was revealing international connections that involved terrorist organizations in several countries. The sophistication of the operation was particularly concerning to intelligence officials. The terrorists had demonstrated capabilities that suggested extensive training and significant financial backing. Their ability to acquire military-grade explosives, their detailed knowledge of royal security protocols, and their complex communication systems all pointed to a level of organization that exceeded anything previously seen in domestic terrorism. Commissioner Williams briefed Parliament on the scope of the threat in a classified session that left many politicians shaken by how close the country had come to experiencing a catastrophic attack. The fact that it had been prevented by a child's overheard conversation highlighted both the random nature of terrorist threats and the importance of encouraging citizens to report suspicious activities. Operation Golden Crown has prevented what could have been the most devastating terrorist attack in our nation's history, Commissioner Williams told the assembled members of Parliament. The intelligence we've gathered suggests that this conspiracy had the potential to cause hundreds of casualties and create widespread panic throughout London. It was stopped because an 8-year-old boy had the courage to report what he had overheard, and because one of our protection officers had the wisdom to take that report seriously. The political implications of the investigation were also becoming clear. Several of the arrested terrorists had connections to radical political movements that had been operating openly in Britain for years. Their transition from political activism to violent terrorism raised questions about how such organizations were monitored and when intervention became necessary. Meanwhile, Timothy was struggling with the sudden transformation of his life from ordinary schoolboy to national hero. The constant attention from media and strangers made him uncomfortable, and he found himself longing for the simple anonymity he had enjoyed just a week earlier. His grandmother did her best to maintain normal routines, but everything felt different now. The planned ceremony at Buckingham Palace was generating enormous public interest. Security arrangements were unprecedented, given the recent terrorist threat and the symbolic importance of the event. The ceremony would represent not just recognition for Timothy's bravery, but a statement that the monarchy and British institutions had emerged stronger from the attempted attack. Detective Sergeant Morrison continued to visit Timothy regularly, partly for security reasons, but also because he had developed genuine affection for the brave boy. Morrison had worked in law enforcement for over 20 years, but he had never encountered someone so young who had shown such extraordinary courage under pressure. "Are you nervous about meeting the Queen?" Morrison asked during one of his visits. Timothy considered the question seriously. "A little bit, but she seems nice in her letter, and I have questions I want to ask her." "What kind of questions?" "I want to know if she's ever been really scared, and how she stays brave when bad things happen." Morrison smiled at the thoughtfulness of the question. Timothy's experience had matured him in ways that were both remarkable and concerning. The boy had been forced to confront adult realities of violence and danger that most children his age never encountered. But rather than being traumatized by the experience, he seemed to have emerged with a deeper understanding of courage and responsibility. The international media attention was also extraordinary. News outlets from around the world were covering Timothy's story, with particular interest from countries that had experienced similar terrorist threats. The boy's story was being held up as an example of how ordinary citizens could play crucial roles in preventing terrorism, simply by remaining alert and having the courage to report suspicious activities. Child psychologists who had been consulted about Timothy's situation were generally optimistic about his long-term well-being. Dr. Sarah Whitman, a specialist in childhood trauma, observed that Timothy's strong family support system and the positive recognition he was receiving were protective factors that would help him process the experience in a healthy way. Children are often more resilient than adults in situations like this, Dr. Whitman explained in an interview. Timothy was able to act decisively because he hadn't yet learned to doubt his instincts or to dismiss his observations as unimportant. His courage came from innocence and conviction rather than from experience with danger. The upcoming ceremony at Buckingham Palace was planned as a private event, with only Timothy's immediate family, key members of the investigation team, and a small number of officials in attendance. The Queen had specifically requested that the ceremony be kept intimate and child-friendly, understanding that an 8-year-old might be overwhelmed by too much formality. As the day of the ceremony approached, Timothy found himself thinking more about the conversation he had overheard 3 days before the royal visit. He wondered what would have happened if he had been playing inside that day, or if he hadn't understood the significance of what the men were discussing. The randomness of it all made him feel both lucky and burdened by the responsibility that had been placed on his young shoulders. Margaret Fletcher was preparing her grandson's best clothes for the palace visit while marveling at how much their lives had changed in such a short time. Her quiet household had become the center of a national story, and her grandson had become a symbol of courage and civic responsibility. She felt proud, but also protective, wanting to ensure that Timothy could return to a normal childhood once the immediate attention died down. The investigation was entering its final phases, with prosecutors preparing cases against the arrested conspirators. The evidence was overwhelming, and most of the suspects were expected to receive lengthy prison sentences. But the broader questions raised by the conspiracy about radicalization, surveillance, and the vulnerabilities of democratic societies to terrorist threats would continue to be debated for years to come. Timothy Fletcher, the 8-year-old boy at the center of it all, was about to receive formal recognition from the highest levels of British society. But perhaps more importantly, he had learned that sometimes the most ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things simply by choosing to do what they believed was right, even when it seemed like no one was listening. The black Bentley that arrived to collect Timothy and his grandmother on the morning of the ceremony was unlike anything the 8-year-old had ever experienced. The leather seats were soft as butter, and the interior was so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat. Detective Sergeant Morrison sat across from them, wearing his dress uniform complete with medals and decorations that Timothy had never seen before. "Are you ready for this, Timothy?" Morrison asked as they approached the imposing gates of Buckingham Palace. Timothy pressed his nose against the window, watching as the famous red-coated guards snapped to attention and the massive iron gates swung open to admit their vehicle. The palace courtyard beyond was vast and impressive, with perfectly manicured grounds and architecture that spoke of centuries of British history. "I think so," Timothy replied, though his voice carried a hint of nervousness that hadn't been there during the crisis a week earlier. Facing danger had somehow seemed easier than facing royal ceremony. The past week had been a whirlwind of activity. The final arrests in Operation Golden Crown had brought the total number of captured conspirators to 15, effectively dismantling what intelligence officials described as the most sophisticated domestic terrorist network in modern British history. The evidence gathered during the investigation had revealed connections to international terrorist organizations in 3 different countries, leading to diplomatic efforts to track down additional cells operating abroad. Margaret Fletcher squeezed her grandson's hand as their car came to a stop in front of the palace's main entrance. She was wearing her best dress and a hat that she had purchased specifically for the occasion, though she still felt somewhat underdressed for such a grand setting. The past week had transformed their quiet lives into something resembling a fairy tale, complete with media attention, police protection, and now a personal audience with the Queen of England. Mrs. Fletcher, Timothy, said a distinguished gentleman in a morning coat who appeared at their car door. I'm Sir Charles Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary. Her Majesty is very much looking forward to meeting you both. They were escorted through corridors lined with priceless paintings and into a series of rooms that Timothy recognized from picture books about the royal family. Everything was larger and more magnificent than he had imagined, from the crystal chandeliers to the ornate furniture that had been crafted by master artisans centuries earlier. The ceremony itself was to be held in the Queen's private study, a relatively intimate room by palace standards, but still impressively furnished with antique books, family photographs, and symbols of the monarchy's long history. Timothy was fascinated by the personal touches that made the space feel lived in despite its grandeur. Her Majesty will be joining us momentarily, Sir Charles explained as they were seated in comfortable chairs near a fireplace. She wanted this to be an informal occasion where she could speak with Timothy personally rather than conducting a traditional formal ceremony. The investigation had concluded with remarkable success. All 15 members of the terrorist conspiracy were in custody. Their planned attacks had been prevented, and the intelligence gathered had led to significant improvements in national security protocols. The devices they had planned to detonate would have killed at least 200 people and injured hundreds more, making Timothy's overheard conversation one of the most consequential intelligence breaks in modern British history. Commissioner Williams had briefed the Queen personally on the scope of the threat that had been prevented, emphasizing that without Timothy's warning, the royal visit would have ended in tragedy. The 8-year-old boy's decision to act on his instincts had saved not only the Queen's life, but potentially the lives of hundreds of innocent spectators who had come to celebrate their monarch. When Queen Elizabeth II entered the room, Timothy was struck by how much smaller and more approachable she seemed in person than in her official photographs. She was wearing a simple blue dress with a pearl necklace, and her smile was warm and genuine as she approached their small group. Timothy, the Queen said, extending her hand to the boy who stood quickly and bowed slightly as he had been instructed, I am so very pleased to meet you. You have shown extraordinary courage, and I wanted to thank you personally. Your Majesty, Timothy replied, his voice clear despite his nervousness. I was just trying to help. I didn't want anything bad to happen to you. The Queen's expression softened at the simple sincerity of his response. She had been briefed extensively on Timothy's background and character, and she had been particularly moved by reports of how he had persisted in trying to warn someone despite initial dismissal from adults around him. Please, sit down, the Queen said, settling into a chair that brought her to Timothy's eye level. I understand you're interested in stories about knights and dragons. Timothy's face lit up with excitement. Yes, Your Majesty. I have lots of books about them. Grandmother says that knights were real people who protected their kingdom from danger. Indeed they were, the Queen replied with a smile. And what you did last week was very much like what those ancient knights did. You saw danger threatening innocent people, and you chose to act courageously to protect them. The parallel between Timothy's actions and the legendary knights he admired had not occurred to him before, but hearing it from the Queen herself made him sit up straighter with pride. Detective Sergeant Morrison, watching the interaction, was struck by how naturally the Queen connected with the young boy, making him feel comfortable and valued rather than overwhelmed by the formal setting. I brought something for you, the Queen continued, producing a small leather box from a nearby table. This is the Queen's commendation for brave conduct, which is normally awarded to adults who show exceptional courage in protecting others. You are the youngest person ever to receive this honor. The medal inside the box was beautiful, with an elegant ribbon and an inscription that read for brave conduct, along with Timothy's name and the date. But what impressed Timothy even more was a second item in the box, a small pin shaped like a knight's sword, which the Queen explained was a personal gift from her private collection. "Every true knight needs a sword," she said with a conspiratorial whisper, "even if it's only a symbolic one." The ceremony continued with the Queen pinning the medal to Timothy's jacket while photographers captured the historic moment. But the formal elements were brief, and most of the time was spent in conversation between the Queen and her young guest. She asked about his school, his interests, and his family, treating him not as a symbol or celebrity, but as an 8-year-old boy who deserved recognition for his exceptional actions. Margaret Fletcher found herself in conversation with Sir Charles and Detective Sergeant Morrison about the broader implications of the case. The investigation had revealed that the terrorist conspiracy had been years in the planning, with members carefully positioned in various locations throughout London to support their coordinated attack. The sophistication of their operation had surprised even experienced counterterrorism officials. "The intelligence we gathered will help prevent similar attacks for years to come," Morrison explained. "But it's sobering to realize how close they came to success. Without Timothy's warning, we never would have detected the threat in time." The Queen, overhearing this conversation, turned back to Timothy with a serious expression. "What you did required a special kind of courage, Timothy. It's one thing to be brave when everyone around you agrees that there's danger. It's much harder to be brave when you're just a child and the adults don't believe you. But you trusted your instincts and kept trying to warn someone even when it seemed like no one was listening." Timothy thought about this for a moment before responding. "My grandmother always says that if something doesn't feel right, I should tell someone about it. Even if I'm wrong, it's better to be safe." "Your grandmother is a very wise woman," the Queen replied, smiling at Margaret Fletcher. "And you're a very brave boy who listened to that wisdom." The conversation turned to Timothy's future plans, and the Queen was delighted to learn that he was considering a career in law enforcement when he grew up. She suggested that he continue studying hard in school and perhaps consider joining the police cadets when he was old enough. Detective Sergeant Morrison offered to stay in touch and provide guidance as Timothy developed his interests in public service. As the ceremony drew to a close, the Queen presented Timothy with one final gift, a personally signed photograph of herself with a message thanking him for his service to the Crown. But she also gave him something even more valuable, her personal telephone number, with instructions to call if he ever needed help or if he encountered any other situations where he felt unsafe. "Sometimes," she explained, "the most important thing we can do is make sure that brave people like you know they have support when they need it." The ride back to their neighborhood felt different from the journey to the palace. Timothy clutched his medal and his knight's pin, but he was thinking more about the Queen's words and about the formal recognition. She had made him understand that what he had done wasn't just lucky or coincidental. It was the result of choices he had made to pay attention, to care about others, and to act on his convictions even when it was difficult. The media coverage of the ceremony was extensive but respectful, focusing on the historic nature of Timothy's recognition rather than sensationalizing his story. Editorial writers used the occasion to reflect on the importance of civic responsibility and the role that ordinary citizens could play in protecting their communities from threats. Detective Sergeant Morrison had been promoted to detective inspector in recognition of his role in the investigation, but he continued to maintain regular contact with Timothy and his family. The bond forged during those critical moments at the royal barrier had developed into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting others. The terrorist conspirators were eventually tried and convicted on multiple charges, receiving sentences that ranged from 15 years to life in prison. Their planned attack, which would have been devastating both in terms of casualties and psychological impact, became instead a testament to the effectiveness of community vigilance and professional law enforcement working together. Timothy returned to school as something of a celebrity, but his teachers worked carefully to help him maintain a sense of normalcy while processing his extraordinary experience. Child psychologists continued to monitor his adjustment, but all reports suggested that he was handling the attention and responsibility remarkably well for someone his age. 6 months after the ceremony at Buckingham Palace, Timothy received a letter from the Queen informing him that a scholarship had been established in his name to support young people interested in careers in public service. The Timothy Fletcher Scholarship would provide educational opportunities for children who demonstrated exceptional civic responsibility and courage in their communities. Years later, when Timothy did indeed join the Metropolitan Police as he had told the Queen he might, he would carry with him the lessons learned during those frightening and extraordinary days in May 1987. He understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act on your convictions even when you're afraid. He knew that sometimes the most important voices belong to those who seem too young or too insignificant to be taken seriously. And he never forgot that a single moment of attention and action could change the course of history. The boy who had saved the Queen grew up to become a man who dedicated his life to protecting others, inspired by a conversation he had overheard in his grandmother's garden, and a royal guard who had the wisdom to listen to a frightened child's warning. His story became part of the training curriculum for law enforcement officers, reminding them that intelligence could come from the most unexpected sources and that sometimes the smallest voices carried the most important messages. Timothy Fletcher's medal remained on display in his childhood bedroom at his grandmother's house, along with a knight's pin that the Queen had given him personally. But the real legacy of his actions lived on in the lives that were saved, the security improvements that were implemented, and the understanding that heroes could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances when courage met opportunity and found the strength to act.